Intamin has become well known in the coaster community as the manufacturer that takes huge risks. But Intamin doesn't just take risks. They take the risks in a certain reoccurring pattern which works wonders for Intamin. They use other coaster manufacturers' successful coaster models, take notes on what made them a success, and add those most successful parts to their own new coasters. This could be taking elements, making beta versions, and sometimes just adding a launch instead of a lift hill. This technique is a big part of how Intamin works, and without this strategy, they would not be where they are today. So at the end of the day, is Intamin a risk-taking manufacturer, or are they just smarter than everyone else? There are a lot of coaster manufacturers out there. You have B&M, who has mastered the art of making fun rides everyone enjoys. You've got RMC, the kid who came out of nowhere, quickly becoming the best at rapid-fire airtime and inversions. Then there's Intamin, the absolute savage. In this video, I'm going to predict what Intamin will look like in the near future and what coasters Intamin will innovate off of next. So I don't want to waste your time, so I'm going to get straight to the point. Intamin is not afraid. The way Intamin works in the coaster industry is they innovate on successes of other manufacturers. They take risks based off of other risks that have worked, if that makes sense. They don't care if it's originally another manufacturer's idea. When they see possible business, they will go for it. But the key point is not that they are copying other manufacturers. That would be like putting Intamin in the same category as Golden Horse, which, obviously, is not the case. Golden Horse takes other coaster models and makes their own version, except it's cheaper and it sucks. Intamin takes other coaster models and innovates on them, and brings their own better version to the table. That's why Intamin is not known as the knockoff. They're known as the favorite. So I've been talking about how Intamin is good at copying other manufacturers for a while now, without giving any examples. So here are the best examples of times Intamin has innovated off of other coasters. Then with that knowledge, we'll get into the future. In 2004, Vekoma released the first ever motorbike coaster. Fast forward 3 years, and Intamin comes out with their very own version, the Intamin Motorbike Coaster, now in 2021, just as popular. In 2016, Mack Rides released the first ever hypercoaster with an inversion, with Flash. Intamin sees that it works, and in 2018, 2 years later, comes Hyperion, Intamin's first ever hypercoaster with an inversion. In 2018, RMC came out with the RMC Raptor model, the first ever single rail coaster. This was completely a new concept and was an icon of RMC. Well, fast forward 2 years and Intamin releases their single rail coaster, the Intamin Hot Racer. I must admit, this is Intamin innovation to an extreme. Like everything from the track and the train is super similar. But of course, the Intamin Hot Racer is the first ever single rail coaster with a launch, which is a perfect example of bringing their own version to the table. So based off of these examples, you realize that Intamin innovates on the most popular ideas that have proven to be successful for the manufacturer. I mean, that's total common sense, right? Like, let's say a basketball team wants to draft a new basketball player. They're most likely gonna want a player that has proven to be reliable over a long period of time. Not a basketball player that scores 15 points on one game, then 2 points the next game, and is injured half the time. Or in coaster terms, a coaster that is always breaking down. So if you use that knowledge for predicting the future coasters that Intamin will innovate on, it all starts to get a lot easier to predict. Think about today's most long-term successful roller coasters that Intamin has not innovated on yet. Well, those are probably the next coasters that Intamin will innovate on. When you think about it like that, it becomes a pretty simple concept. And side note, Intamin has so much success innovating off of other coasters where it's basically guaranteed that Intamin will continue to do this for their future. Now let's get into predicting. The B&M Dive Coaster is a B&M classic. There have been 16 of these sold, 6 in the last 3 years. The Dive Coaster is one of B&M's biggest successes. And I think in the near future, Intamin will come out with their very own version of the dive coaster. I think it would totally make a lot of sense. B&M dive coasters are all pretty much the same ride, yet 16 of them have sold. That means that this layout is what theme parks are looking for. So if Intamin does innovate on a dive coaster, the Intamin version will most likely create some diversity in the dive coaster market. And I think that will be something theme parks are looking for. An idea that has proven to work, but in a new creative form to attract more guests. I definitely think that it will be taken well by enthusiasts if it happens. or when it happens. A big coaster model that Intamin has not shown interest to yet is the flying coaster. Like the single rail coaster and the motorbike coaster, which Intamin has innovated on, the flying coaster is a one-of-a-kind creative coaster. As we know it, so far there is no such thing as an Intamin flying coaster, and I think that it will probably stay that way. I think the odds of Intamin making their very own flying coaster is not impossible, but very low. And it's simply because there's too much competition for flying coasters. There's simply just not enough theme parks interested in them. From 2016 till 2021, there have only been 3 sold flying coasters. So I think the flying coaster is gonna stay a B&M, Vekoma, and Zamperla thing for now. Moving on, when you think about long-term successors, a big one is the SS Freespin coasters. I know. Intamin has already tried the Freespin coaster before in the early 2000s, and, well, it was an absolute fail. But SNS Freespins changed the whole image of Freespins. If Intamin did make a new Freespin coaster, it would be a completely different ride from the past 4D coaster, because now Intamin knows what works thanks to SNS. The SNS Freespins are not god-tier coasters, they're far from that, but they are what is giving SNS the most passive income. SNS Freespins are very clonable rides. In the last 6 years, SNS has sold 11 of these Freespins all over the world, counting where I live, Japan. That is like totally successful. Freespins aren't huge fan favorites because they have been cloned so much. So if Intamin does release their own, it should definitely have some big differences from the SNS. Cause if it didn't, then theme parks would just buy the SNS version. So in Intamin's near future, I predict that Intamin is going to give their take on the dive coaster and the SNS Freespin coaster. Of course, there's other coasters they might innovate on, like the wing coaster, a boomerang coaster, a family invert coaster, and as time goes, the new coaster models that we don't know about yet. But there is also elements. Intamin innovates on elements too. Now, I don't want this video to be too long, so I'm gonna predict only one element. I predict that Intamin is gonna start using the dive drop. You find dive drops as the first element on B&M wing coasters. Basically, you invert and you don't fix, and the inversion becomes a full drop. I think you guys know what a dive drop is. These drops are big GP and enthusiast pleasers, and we might find one on a Intamin coaster one day. So, that was my take on what Intamin is planning for the coaster industry. I honestly loved this whole concept, and also I just want to say thank you for 700 subscribers. You know, we hit that milestone with my last video and got 50 more. It's really awesome to think that 700 people are involved with Max Thrills. Okay guys, this is the end of my video. Now go watch all my other ones. Peace.
Oh my gosh, you made it till the end!